spent some time in the council offices last week, talking with them about the management of a particular urban green space near where I live in Gloucester. I'm involved in a small community group that we are calling Green Abbey, and what we are doing is looking at the wildlife management, or the management for the sake of wildlife, of one of the community green spaces. So encouraging more flowers, more for the bees, more for the insects, more for habitats for nature, for birds. The backstory to Green Abbey is that at an event a few years ago, we were asked to pray to invite God to guide us in any new direction that God might be taking us. And the phrase caring for the wild margins came to mind and hasn't let me go ever since. I took it away, prayed it through, talked with a few people, couldn't work out what it was about, put it down for a while, came back to it, tried some stuff, couldn't quite work out what I was supposed to be doing with it. Now, maybe I didn't hear God right, maybe I'm kind of just onto a bit of a wild goose chase here, but the phrase didn't leave me, this sense of caring for the wild margins in the community where I live. Cutting a longer story short, 4 years later, it's beginning to find some focus. I am exploring with some others in our local community, and we are beginning to do some work. We pruned an old orchard that is in this particular community green space. We've been looking at what's already growing there and beginning to make a management plan for where we will go from here. I also coordinate or co-facilitate Robinswood Forest Church. We meet on Robinswood Hill in Gloucester City roughly every 6 weeks, and we explore the natural world within the framework of some Christian prayer. I've come to regard these things as an important part of my Christian discipleship, of how I live as a Christian. It seems to me that how I treat God's non-human creation is as much a part of how I live out my faith as how I treat people. It's not that one's higher or lower priority, but we tend to talk in church about the people stuff. We tend to talk less about the natural world and the environment. And yet, the outdoors is a place that brings spirituality alive for so many people, that sense in the outdoors of the presence of God in and through the natural world. I'm not talking about the big picture stuff this week. I know that Arthur is with you at your next Benefice service talking about our current climate emergency and the big world international issues that are related to the natural world. So what I'm talking about today is small and local, with the nature that is on our doorstep, seeing that as Christian discipleship, seeing that as living out our Christian faith, seeing that as prayer. So what I'm going to do is talk very briefly about the Bible readings that we've heard. Then I'm going to set a bit of a bigger picture of what the Bible has to say about these things. I'm going to refer to some contemporary themes in our society, and then leave with you a couple of questions that we might chat about over coffee, should you feel so inclined. So the Bible readings, the first one that we heard from the letter to Colossians, talking here about Jesus and how Jesus and the natural world fit together, if I can put it that way. Verse 15 talks about all things being created through Christ. Verse 17, everything held in God. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And then as we go through to the end, there's a sense that the work of the cross is about all of creation. It's not just about me and my relationship with God. It's not even about us and our relationship with God, but it's bigger even than that. There is something about the fallenness of the whole creation that God reconciles in and through the work of the cross. God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. We have in here a reminder to widen our vision in terms of the work of God, the kinds of things that God is involved in, the things that we as Christians rightly care about. It's not just about people, it's about all creation. The gospel reading, I asked for a reading where Jesus was taking an illustration from nature, because that is the core of what we do as Forest Church. We spend time in the natural world. We ask God to speak to us through what we find there. The wheat and the weeds. I think of that so often when I'm gardening, the wheat and the weeds. In my garden, we have a lot of willow herb. That's the weed that is the favourite for our particular garden where I live. We also have lots of self-seeded snapdragons, and when they're small, it's really hard to tell the difference. So if I went along picking up all of the tiny shoots that were coming through, I'd probably have no snapdragons ever, because I'd have just taken the lot out. So that sense that you just have to leave it a bit and wait until the right moment so resonates with what I see when I'm gardening. And I think there are so many of the things that Jesus talks about where he's taking an illustration from the natural world, and there is that sense that as we do as Forest Church, he's looking at what's around, and he's learning from God at work in creation and God in the natural world, and then talking about that, and it comes out in so many of his parables. So much farming in there, isn't there? So much about growth and harvest and sheep and shepherds and olive trees and all of these stuff, orchards, the vine and the branches, so rooted in how the natural world lives, and that there is that sense that Jesus was finding his quiet spaces quite often outdoors with God, looking, learning, and through that God's wisdom came out. We do this in Forest Church. I'll give you an example. Particular Forest Church gathering, and I had invited people to go and spend 10 minutes by themselves, just wandering, praying, looking, asking God to speak in and through what they found. It was in a place that I didn't know, because I was a guest on this particular occasion. So I took a path and I didn't know where it was going, and I found myself it was pretty overgrown by holly, basically, and so I had to fight my way through. So then I found myself reflecting about holly and how important holly is at certain times of year, and the berries as the food for a really, really important foodstuff in the winter. And there was me getting a bit annoyed and cross by this holly. And then I found myself reflecting on the people that are a bit prickly, that we might kind of find a little bit difficult, but then wondering what gift they have to offer, what's their special thing, just as the holly is a really important foodstuff in the winter, but I was finding it a bit difficult at that moment. What about the people around me that are like the holly, sometimes perhaps a bit prickly, but with a very unique and special gift to offer that needs to be valued? So it's just one example of the way wisdom comes as we engage in the natural world. The big picture of the Bible. I'm going to refer at this point to a guy called Walter Brueggemann, who is he's a theologian who looks at the big stories, the major threads running through the Bible. So often we look at a little bit at a time. We look at one passage that we've heard in church on a Sunday morning. But he doesn't do that. He looks at the big threads that are running as themes through the Bible. So one of the things that he says is that it will no longer do to talk about Yahweh, God, and God's people. We need to talk about God and the people and the land. And he has this sense that there is a three-way relationship. It's not just us and God, it's us and God and the land in a triangle, a three-way relationship. We're talking here about land in its earthiness, in the sense of the soil, the growth, the harvests, all of the natural world around us. I think we sometimes read the stuff in the Bible about the land as being about political boundaries. And that some of that's in there, but he's really clear that the sense of a three-way relationship in the Bible is about the earthiness and the growth and the life that's in the soil. So the God, the people, and the land. There's an awful lot of agriculture in the Bible. It's known as that phrase, the land of milk and honey. That's about growth and life and food. There are instructions about agriculture. The resting of the land, Sabbath for the land as well as Sabbath for the people, which we call fallow years in this country. And there's a sense that the well-being of the land and the well-being of the people are interconnected, that you can't have one without the other. You can't have the thriving of the people without the thriving of the land. And the land won't thrive unless the people thrive. It all goes together, held in God, as we heard in Colossians, all held together in Christ. It's really interesting how this old biblical wisdom connects with contemporary themes in our society that people are talking about in terms of well-being and mental health and environmentalism. We need nature, and nature needs us. I hear people talking about environmental destruction as a spiritual crisis. Even from people who don't hold a particular faith position, there is this sense that if we're going to get this right, if we're going to learn to live well with our natural world, there's a spirituality running through that we need to get right as well. The spirituality of the natural world I referred to briefly at the beginning, that sense of the outdoors being the place where our spirits lift to God. There's a lot of research about well-being linked to time spent in green spaces. Research about things like if you find yourself in hospital, if you can see a tree out of your hospital room, there is actually, the recovery rate is quicker. There is some real solid research about just something about the natural world that seems to be good for us, which, if that's how we were created to be, kind of makes sense. There's research about the invisible disabilities, autistic spectrum, ADHD, and all of this kind of stuff, and how children just settle and thrive and become kind of more earthed and rooted outdoors than they do indoors. Again, if that's how we're created to be, some of these things seem to be about the canary in the cage, you know, the first people to react when something's a bit off. And perhaps we need to hear that and listen to that. Nature needs us. Conservation volunteering. I do conservation volunteering. I talked about Green Abbey, but in other places as well. A lot of it's about cutting things back. It's gardening on a big scale. It's keeping the brambles from taking over, because actually if we didn't do some cutting back, eventually there'd be forest, but a lot of habitats would be lost and particular species would be lost because we've been managing the land over the centuries for years and years. So nature needs us. Nature needs us to plant trees as well. I've perhaps anticipating what Arthur might say next week, but in terms of the carbon balance in the environment, more trees is a good thing. That helps us balance everything out. And then not doing the stuff that's destructive. That takes a bit more effort because our society is in some bad habits. And so taking the effort to do things a little bit differently to change some of our habits. And the final thing I want to say by way of this theme is the idea of falling in love with nature as a better route into environmental responsibility than guilt-tripping everybody with, if you don't do this, everything will go horribly wrong. Once we start to fall in love with nature, once we spend time in the natural world, we start to want to do the things which enables it to thrive. And the wildlife trusts, the national trusts, 50 things, if you have children or grandchildren that have done the National Trust 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4, all of the things that a lot of the wildlife trusts and the National Trust are encouraging children to connect with the natural world, because actually that has a knock-on effect in us falling in love with the natural world and then wanting to live well with regards to it. All of this makes total sense, all of these themes that we're hearing in wider society, if there is supposed to be a three-way relationship with God, the people and the land. If that is the way that God has made us to be, then of course we need the natural world and the natural world needs us. And all of that held within God, within a sense of the spirituality of the natural world. There's supposed to be a profound connection between people and nature. So what we're hearing in these various strands in our society at the moment is deeply, deeply Christian. I'm coming to the end, just ready to leave you with some questions which we can continue to talk about over coffee if you would like to. So the first question is to invite you to think about how you personally express a love of nature, whether it's gardening or walking or watching a bee, recycling and other lifestyle choices. What is it for you? Secondly, how does this connect with your membership of your church and your Christian faith? And thirdly, I wonder what God might be nudging you to do, if there's another thing in this area of life and faith that you might like to explore.